The morning mist in the town of Aurelianum rolled low over the cobblestones, like a veil of forgotten breath. Lanterns glimmered faintly on doorsteps, still lit from the night before, their light flickering like the memory of prayers unanswered. In that fog, a figure stirred, a silhouette tall and deliberate, cloaked in wool and oilskin, boots soaked from dew, and eyes hidden behind glinting glass. He was not yet a plague doctor, but he was about to become one. Alaric was a barber surgeon, a modest tradesman with steady hands and a quiet disposition. He stitched wounds and pulled teeth, drained boils and lanced abscesses. He knew the pulse of the town, not by gossip, but by the warmth or coolness beneath a patient's skin. He was neither noble nor scholarly, but he was useful, and that, in such days, was often enough. When the first corpse was found by the riverbank, limbs stiff, lips dark, eyes weeping blackness, it was dismissed as a tragic misfortune. But when 3 more followed within a week, and 7 the week after, the whispers began. The whispers were low at first, like the rustling of a rat's tail against the grain sacks in the cellar. But as the bells began to toll more frequently, and as the priest refused to enter certain homes, it became clear. Death had returned. They called it many things: the pestilence, the great mortality, God's punishment. But all names led to the same truth. The plague was here. A summons arrived, rolled in stiff parchment and sealed with wax as dark as dried blood. It was not an invitation. It was a command. In the name of the city and the Guild of Health, Alaric of Aurelianum is hereby conscripted, as physician ordinary, charged with containment and care of the affliction presently spreading among the populace. He was to be a plague doctor. The city would provide lodging, a modest stipend, and reasonable protection. He was instructed to present himself at the Guildhall by dawn. They would give him the garments, the tools, the instructions, but they did not offer a choice. Alaric sat by the hearth that night, the fire crackling in a gentle rhythm, like the final breaths of someone sleeping deeply. His hands rested on his knees. He did not tremble. He did not cry. But his breath came, slower, heavier, as though he were already learning to breathe through linen and leather. His wife had died 2 winters prior, her lungs taken by the cold and the wet that crept in through the cracks in the walls. His children were gone, some to marriage, one to the monastery. He had only his hands now, and soon even they would no longer feel the sun on their bare skin. The next morning, the suit was waiting. It hung from a wooden stand like a second skin, a grim costume meant not for ceremony, but survival. The robe was waxed canvas, thick and stiff, dyed a colour that had once been black, but had faded with exposure and time. The gloves were of goatskin, tight and cracking at the knuckles. The mask was a horror of its own, shaped like the beak of a crow, long and curved. It protruded from the face like a promise of separation. It was meant to hold dried flowers, camphor, and vinegar-soaked sponges, things believed to cleanse the air of the miasmas that carried death. 2 glass discs were set over the eyes, wide and emotionless. The whole effect was neither human nor a beast, but something between. When Alaric donned it for the first time, he could smell the sweat of previous wearers. The scent clung like memory. They gave him a cane, a thin rod of ashwood, polished smooth. It was not for support, but for distance. With it, he was to lift blankets, point at wounds, ward off the curious and the sick. It was his measure against closeness. That afternoon, they sent him to the southern quarter. The streets there had grown quiet. Windows were shuttered, not from cold, but from dread. White crosses were smeared on doors with quicklime. Rags soaked, in garlic hung from nails, swaying slightly in the stale air. He entered his first house with a knock that was not answered. Inside, the air was heavy. A child lay on a straw pallet, lips cracked, skin blotched with the telltale buboes, those swollen nodes that rose beneath the armpits and groin, like the earth buckling before a grave opens. Alaric crouched, the beak mask casting a shadow over the child's face. He reached out with gloved hands, gently peeling back the linen from the swollen flesh. There was no treatment he could offer, only observation, only notes, only the ritual of presence. The mother sat in the corner, unmoving, her eyes glazed. He had not seen her at first. She did not speak. She simply watched him through the fog of fever or grief. It was difficult to say which. When he turned to leave, she spoke in a whisper as dry as parchment. "Will he die?" Alaric paused. "I do not know," he said, and the words echoed in the mask, made hollow and strange. But he did know. He returned to his quarters that night and cleaned his tools in vinegar. He burned his outer garments. He recorded the visit in the register. He did not eat. He slept only in fragments, waking to the smell of lavender from the herbs tucked into the lining of his mask, and to the memory of the boy's sunken chest. Outside, the bells tolled again. The beak from the outside appeared ominous, grotesque even. But for those who wore it, it was a world unto itself. Within the elongated nose of the plague, Doctor's mask lay small chambers of aromatic defense. Cloves, dried rose petals, crushed mint, myrrh, and lavender were carefully arranged and changed out each week. Some physicians added sponge, soaked in camphor or vinegar. Others preferred juniper or pine resin. It was believed these herbs would neutralize the poisoned air called miasma, a breath of pestilence floating invisibly through city lanes and narrow corridors. Yet inside the mask, the scent was no comfort. It was too close, too insistent. Breathing became deliberate, shallow. Each inhalation filtered through layers of linen and spice, each exhalation fogging the inner glass lenses until the world outside blurred. The mask created a chamber of solitude, an echoing cavern where one's voice was transformed into a hollow whisper, stripped of warmth. Alaric, once a man of steady words and soft tone, now found his voice estranged from him. Children cried at his approach, their eyes wide at the sight of the towering figure with a bird's face and heavy cloak. Even adults, in their grief or desperation, often turned their eyes downward, refusing to meet the lifeless stare of those glass eyes. Over time, Alaric learned to accept the separation. It was not a matter of choice. It became necessary. The mask protected his body, yes, but it also began to change his mind. Each morning, he donned it like a priest his vestments. The ritual was methodical. Linen cap, undergarments soaked lightly in vinegar, wool tunic, waxed overcoat, gloves tied tightly at the wrist, and then the mask, lowered gently over the face, secured with leather straps behind the head. The final piece was the wide-brimmed hat, a symbol of his role. It did little to shield from sun or rain, but it marked him, unmistakably, as a servant of the sick. His days began in silence. He rose before the sun, recited quiet prayers not to God, whose silence he had begun to resent, but to the wind and the soil, the things that persisted. He would eat a crust of bread, sometimes softened in weak broth, and sip from a cup of boiled water laced with rosemary. There was little time for indulgence. Food lost its taste when consumed under the weight of sorrow. In his satchel, he carried the tools of his grim craft: a scalpel, a set of tweezers, oil of lilies, and a small jar of mercury. He had a wax tablet for recording symptoms and deaths. He also carried a miniature hourglass, not for tracking time, but for focus. When he felt overwhelmed by the stillness of the dying, he would flip it and allow the sand to measure his courage. The city had given him a room in the former bakery near the old wall, quiet and cool. Its oven was now a hearth where he burned his robes each week for fear of contagion. He lived alone, and no one visited. His neighbours brought food in cloth bundles and left them at the threshold. Though he never heard their voices, he came to recognise their footsteps. Some plague doctors, Alaric had heard, drank wine heavily, unable to sleep unless their minds were dulled. Others visited brothels, rationalising their need for warmth in a time so cold. Some were cruel, treating the sick as vermin to be counted and discarded. Alaric, by contrast, kept to his rituals. They were the only constants in a world unsteady. He marked each death with a carved tally on a length of wood, one board for each street. These he hid under his floorboards, unable to burn them, unable to throw them away. At night, he sometimes removed the mask and sat by the single window of his room. Through it, he could see the bell tower, always looming, always tolling. There, he would whisper names. He remembered the child from the southern quarter, and the girl whose mother begged Alaric to pray with her, though her breath had already ceased. He remembered the merchant who offered him coins if he would only declare him well, though his neck was already black with rot. He whispered their names like a litany, not to remember their deaths, but to keep their lives from vanishing entirely. In the streets, people spoke of him as the Crowman. Some feared him, others respected him. A few even left candles outside their homes in silent thanks. But none spoke to him directly unless required. His world was made of glances and gestures. Silence was the common tongue of pestilence. Once, he was called to the quarters near the river, a tangle of alleyways and rotting timbers where the poorest lived. He expected death. Instead, he found music. A girl, perhaps no older than 10, sat in a corner with a small harp, plucking notes soft as breath. Her parents were already gone, faces covered, bodies cooling, but she played, her fingers moving with memory, not understanding. Alaric stood in the doorway, unmoving. She looked up and paused. For a moment, there was no fear in her eyes, only confusion. Then slowly, she played again. He sat beside the hearth as she finished her song. He did not speak. He did not reach for his cane. When she was done, he nodded and left her a small vial of honey taken from his personal ration. It was against the rules, but so was dying, and that rule was broken every day. Back in his quarters, Alaric stared at his mask. It rested on the table, now its beak curving into the dim light like a sleeping bird. He reached out and ran a finger along its edge. He wondered what the girl had seen when she looked at him. A monster, a priest, a man. He did not know, but the music remained in his mind, soft and uninvited. That night he slept without herbs. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the wind was still and even the rats seemed to rest, a sound would break the stillness. It began low, like the breath of a sleeping city stirring from a troubled dream. Then it rose, a single bell, heavy and slow. Clang, clang, clang. 3 times it rang, each note a solemn declaration. Someone had died. For Alaric, the bell had become a measure of time more than the sun or the stars. It told him how many had perished through the night. 1 bell for each soul, 1 toll for each name he would never know. At first, the bells were rung by the clergy, but as their numbers dwindled, the task fell to others. Young boys, orphaned by the plague, were paid a crumb of bread for each toll. They climbed the narrow steps with hands already thin, eyes shadowed, not by age, but by sorrow, too old for their years. The city never asked whether the bells comforted or haunted. They simply rang. Each part of Aurelianum had its own bell tower, each with a slightly different pitch. Alaric came to recognize them like voices in a crowd. The deep one by the harbour meant the disease had reached the fishermen. The sharp, piercing tone from the east meant the artisans and masons were succumbing. The tiny chapel bell near the northern wall, barely louder than a whisper, meant the beggars were dying. Sound became map. Sound became story. As he walked through the streets, Alaric noticed how people responded. Some paused and crossed themselves, whispering prayers. Others flinched, then kept walking. A few ignored it entirely, ears dulled by repetition, as if the sound had grown too familiar to hold meaning. But for the doctor, The bell was always a command. It told him where to go. It told him where death waited. One morning, he was summoned to the merchant quarter. The bell had rung 9 times before sunrise, more than he had ever heard in 1 hour. The wind carried the scent of smoke and something else, something sharp and metallic. He walked slowly, his cane tapping softly on the cobblestones. As he turned into the square, he saw them. 9 bodies laid side by side beneath coarse cloth. The guild master stood nearby, arms folded, lips thin. His beard had gone grey overnight. They locked themselves in together, he muttered. Swore they wouldn't leave. Thought it would protect them. Alaric nodded. He made no judgment. Inside the merchant's hall, the air was still. Windows had been nailed shut. A table stood at the centre, with plates still holding the remains of a final meal. Bread hardened by time, wine soured in the cup. They had tried to outwait the plague, but the sickness found a way. He examined each body carefully, noting the pattern of sores, the placement of bruises, the curve of the limbs. These details mattered. Perhaps not for the dead, but for the living. A child's toy was found under the bench, a carved horse, its wheels broken. Alaric placed it in his satchel. He did not know why. When he emerged, the bell rang again. Each death had its sound. But life, too, made noise, though more subtle, more fleeting. He remembered once hearing laughter in the back alley near the baker's shop. It was faint, like the rustling of parchment, but unmistakable. 2 girls chasing one another, scarves trailing behind them like birds in flight. He had turned, just slightly, to watch. They disappeared into a doorway, leaving only echoes. That same doorway bore a white cross the following week. Even the markets had grown silent. Where once there were the shouts of vendors, the clatter of carts, the soft negotiations over salted fish or barley, now there was only stillness. Coins no longer changed hands, for what use was silver to a corpse? Now and then, a lute player would strum outside the apothecary's door, singing soft ballads of saints and springtime. No one stopped to listen. But the notes lingered, caught between walls like trapped ghosts. At night, the city moaned in its sleep. Dogs barked without cause. Cats cried from rooftops. And beneath it all, the wind carried whispers of names, of regrets, of prayers spoken too late. In his room, Alaric tried to write. He had once enjoyed copying the old medical texts, tracing the Latin script with care, letting the shapes soothe him. But now his quill moved clumsily, and the ink ran thin. He began instead to write poems, short ones. They were not beautiful, but they were honest. The bell rings thrice, the air stands still. A shadow knocks and enters without will. He burned each one after reading it aloud. The bells, though, never ceased. Once, he asked the boy who rang them if he grew tired. The boy, no, older than 12, shook his head. "No, sir," he said softly. "I just forget the sound of quiet." That answer stayed with Alaric. He began to wonder if, when all this was over, if silence would return at all, or whether the city would remain forever haunted by its own echoes. He tried to imagine Aurelianum without the bells, without the mask, without the fear, a place of open windows and singing, a place of bread rising in ovens, of cloaks drying in the sun, of church bells ringing not for death, but for weddings. He closed his eyes and listened, but the real bell rang again, cutting through his dream. One more. Soul departed. The city wept without tears, and Alaric rose once more. Not all words were meant to be spoken. Some were too heavy for the tongue, too intimate for the ear. For those, Alaric turned to the page. In the stillness of each night, after cleaning his tools and washing his gloves in vinegar, Alaric would light a single candle and take out his journal. Its cover was worn, leather softened by time and touch, edges curled like old leaves. The pages inside bore a fragrance of ink and ash, and something older, something human. He wrote with deliberate strokes, not as a scholar or poet, but as a man trying to remember he was still alive. These were not clinical records. Those he kept separately in the Guild's official book. The journal, instead, was where he spoke to those who could no longer hear him, where he said the things that he could not say aloud, where he unburdened himself, alone in the company of his own handwriting. He did not always begin with a date. Time had grown blurry. Some entries began simply. It was quiet today. Only 2 bells. But one of them was for the apothecary's wife. She gave me lavender last week. I wish I'd thanked her better. Other days, the entries came faster, as if his hand could not keep pace with his heart. A child cried when I entered. Not because I was frightening, but because she thought I was death himself. Her mother had told her so. I stayed longer than usual. I held her hand. She had no fever, just fear. I don't know if that's worse. Sometimes he addressed the entries as if writing letters. To Lysandra, he wrote one evening. I passed the alley where we first met. The fountain still trickles. I paused there for a moment, though I know you wouldn't want me to linger. I imagined you laughing. I tried to laugh too. It did not come easily. Lysandra had been his wife. She had died not from plague, but from winter. A slow, relentless winter that took her breath as gently as the dawn steals the stars. He had held her hand until the end, whispering songs they once sang when their children were small. He never truly said goodbye. The journal became his voice to her, a thread that tied him to who he had been before the beaked mask and the sorrowed. Silence. He wrote of faces, not names. Those faded quickly, but expressions, small moments, gestures. The man who shared half his bread with a dying neighbor. The woman who sang to her son until her breath failed. The old priest who blessed a street of corpses before collapsing quietly beside them. Alaric feared forgetting more than he feared. The plague. To forget, he believed, was to become less human. And so, each word he wrote was an anchor, a way to hold on. The ink smudged often. His gloves were not meant for writing, and he sometimes had to remove them, working quickly before the cold air dried the skin of his fingers. He kept a cloth nearby to wipe sweat from his brow, though he often waited too long. The journal swelled, with pages. He tied a strip of ribbon around it to keep it closed when not in use. He feared someone finding it, reading it, misunderstanding it, and yet some part of him also hoped it might survive him. So someone, someday, might know he tried. One night, he dreamed of a boy sitting beneath a tree, reading his journal aloud. Birds gathered on the branches. The boy read with wonder, not sorrow. Alaric woke with tears dried on his cheeks. The Guild never asked for his journal. They expected numbers. How many sick, how many recovered, how many dead. They wanted names, if possible, ages, symptoms. But they did not ask how he felt. They did not ask what he saw in the eyes of the dying, or what silence filled the air after they were gone. So he wrote it here. There is a house with a red door, where the shutters are painted with vines. A girl lived there who always smiled, even after her father died. She smiled again when I told her she was well. It was a rare gift. I returned today. The door was open. The shutters were still. She was gone. He never read back more than a few pages. It hurt too much. The journal was not for revisiting. It was for releasing. Some entries were only a few lines. The wind was strong today. It blew away the prayer, ribbons tied to the church gate. I watched them fly, like pale birds. I imagined them carrying wishes to the sky. Foolish, perhaps, but it made me smile. Others filled the page entirely. He wrote not only of people, but of sounds, of smells, of the way the clouds seemed to gather differently now, of how the city had grown quieter not just in volume, but in spirit. Even the pigeons cooed more softly. Even the cats moved more carefully. In one entry, he wrote, "If anyone finds this, know that I did not fear the sick. I feared losing the part of myself that still cared. If I failed, I hope the words here remind you that I tried." On cold nights, he kept the journal beneath his cloak, close to his chest. It warmed slightly with his body heat, the leather softening again. It was a companion of sorts. By the end of winter, he had filled 3 such books. He buried the first one beneath the old oak behind the apothecary's house. The second, he hid in the library ruins, under a broken lectern. The third, he still kept with him. It felt unfinished, as perhaps he was too. In the heart of a dying city, rituals became lifelines, not cures, not comforts in the truest sense, but habits woven from hope and desperation. People needed to do something, anything, to push back against the tide of death rising outside their doors. For many, that meant fire. Smoke curled through the alleyways of Aurelianum in slow, sleepy trails. It drifted from clay pots placed at windowsills and doorsteps, from censers swinging beneath the hands of nervous clergy, from the braziers kindled in each quarter with herbs and oils, meant to cleanse the very air. Alaric would walk through this, haze each morning, the scent of rosemary and sage clinging to his robes. The mask's beak intensified every note, the tang of vinegar, the bitterness of burning bay leaves, the musk of incense smouldering in damp corners. The people believed in fumigation. It was written in the medical treatises of old. That smoke would drive away the corrupted air. The air, they believed, carried invisible poisons, thick with sin and decay. The right scent could purify it, could block the devil's breath. So they burned juniper and laurel. They burned angelica, root and wormwood. Some burned bread crusts soaked in oil and wine. A few burned parchment inscribed with holy verses. A rare, frightened handful even burned their own clothes, or their mattresses, or the possessions of their dead, hoping to erase the memory of illness before it could spread. And in the most desperate of cases, they burned their homes. Alaric had seen the flames rising from a cottage in the northern ward, a thatched roof curling into the sky, embers drifting like stars set adrift. The family stood in the street, barefooted, wrapped in thin shawls. They watched in silence as everything they owned became smoke. When he approached, the father simply said, "It was inside. We had no other choice." They believed the house itself had become sick. These acts were not commanded by any authority. They were born from instinct, from stories passed from parent to child, from the gut-deep terror that reason could not soothe. Even Alaric, trained in the limited medical understanding of his time, did not always intervene. He knew the theory of miasma, the belief that bad air caused illness. He knew that fire changed the air, moved it, warmed it, gave it motion. Whether it saved lives or not was uncertain, but it gave people something to hold on to. The ritual of burning became communal, in some places. Neighbours gathered to light a shared brazier at the centre of the square. Each person brought a branch, or a sprig of herb, or even a scrap of cloth from a loved one's garment. They tossed them in, one by one, watching the smoke rise together. These small ceremonies were not festive. There was no laughter, no singing, but they were sacred in a way. Even Alaric felt it. He once stood beside a dying priest who held a coal pan on his chest. With each breath, the man inhaled smoke from lavender and frankincense, eyes fluttering with pain. He whispered not prayers but memories. The smell, he said, reminded him of his mother's kitchen. He died with a smile. Not all smoke was peaceful. Sometimes it was the scent of despair. Alaric once entered a home where the fire had been lit, too strongly. The family had closed all windows, sealing themselves inside. They had believed the smoke would protect them. Instead, it consumed them. He found them curled together on the floor, soot on their faces, hands still clasped. He did not record the cause in his journal, only the quiet. Each quarter developed its own customs. In the merchant district, families burned orange peels mixed with cloves. In the peasant lanes, it was dried straw braided with pine needles. Near the docks, sailors lit small fires in metal, buckets, and sang low chants as they circled them, asking for mercy from the sea gods as well as heaven. There were stories, of course, of fires that drove the plague away, of neighborhoods untouched because they burned cedar daily, of children who slept beside smoke pots and woke miraculously cured. Alaric treated these stories like smoke themselves, visible, shifting, impossible to hold. He did not dismiss them, but he did not trust them. He knew what he saw, and he saw that even with all the fires, the incense, the prayers, the plague still came. It seeped through cracks, under doors, between the boards of even the most fumigated homes, and yet there was something healing too, in the act of lighting flame against the darkness. He remembered one woman, old, bent-backed, nearly blind. Every evening she stepped outside with her cane, knelt with great difficulty, and lit a small twig bundle, soaked in wine and resin. She placed it on a stone beside her door and whispered words. Alaric passed her house often. He once asked her what she said. She smiled, toothless, and replied, "It's not a spell. It's a song. I just don't sing it anymore." He never heard her words clearly, but he always saw the smoke. In his own room, Alaric burned lavender each night. He placed the sprigs in a clay bowl, lit them carefully, and watched the wisps curl upward, dancing in the candlelight. It did not cure his sorrow, but it gave it shape, gave it scent. The room felt less empty when the smoke was there. Sometimes, in his journal, he drew the shapes he saw in the smoke. Faces, birds, ships. Once, he thought he saw Lysandra's smile. He did not blink until it faded. As the season turned and the air grew warmer, the smoke changed too. It grew heavier, more urgent. The city burned not only in ritual, but in protest. There were those who began setting fire to plague carts, to the bodies within. They believed this would end the cycle, but Alaric knew better. Burning was never about ending the plague. It was about surviving it, one breath at a time, one spark at a time. One prayer, even wordless, carried gently through the curling air. The cane of a plague doctor was never just a walking stick. It was an instrument, a symbol, a barrier, and at times, a burden. Alaric came to know its every scratch and polish, the feel of its grain beneath the leather of his gloves, the quiet thud it made when it tapped stone or wood or soil. It was made of ashwood, strong and light, about 3 feet long, ending in a silver cap with a subtle engraving, an old gilt sigil worn by use. He was told upon receiving it that the cane was his extension, his shield. It was not to be used idly. It was to instruct, to examine, and, if needed, to warn. To the people, the cane meant authority. It meant the plague doctor could enter any home, regardless of status or permission. It meant he was acting not as a man, but as an agent of the city's will. It was a silent statement. I am here, not by choice, but by duty. And for Alaric, that duty was heavy. The cane was used, first to measure distance. In the earliest weeks, before the city was entirely lost to fear, some people still approached him, seeking answers, asking for reassurance, for treatment, for comfort. But the cane, held out between them, set a line they were not to cross. He would raise it slowly, gently even, placing its tip against the ground between them. A quiet message. Stay there. It was not cruelty. It was survival. Children especially struggled to understand. They reached out to touch his mask, to clutch his sleeve. Some thought he was a bird, or a knight in disguise. Alaric began to tap the cane softly against the cobbles, a sound that seemed to hush them gently, as if casting a spell of stillness. With adults, the cane was sometimes misunderstood. They saw it as a weapon, a sign of judgment. But Alaric never raised it in anger. Not once. Even when he was spat upon by a grieving husband, even when he was shouted at by a woman accusing him of bringing the plague into her street. He kept the cane low, steady. He knew it wasn't anger they carried, it was loss. Still, the cane had its practical uses. It allowed him to inspect bodies without touching them. He could lift cloth, turn limbs gently, prod swelling or rot without breaking, the fragile barrier between his safety and their suffering. He used it to test floorboards in weakened homes, to open doors, to stir ash. Sometimes he used it to guide others. He once led a blind man through the ruins of the Candlemaker's Lane, using the cane to tap a rhythm on the stones. Step by step, the old man followed, listening carefully. At the end, he placed a coin in Alaric's gloved hand and whispered, "Even in death's shadow, your path is clear." But the cane could not protect against everything. There were nights when Alaric returned to his quarters, placed the cane beside the hearth, and stared at it. It seemed heavier then, not from use, but from memory. He began to clean it more carefully, rubbing oil into the wood, polishing the silver cap. He knew that, to the city, it was his badge, but to him, it had become something else, a memory keeper. Each mark along its shaft told a story. That darkened spot, where he had dropped it while carrying a fevered child down a stairwell. The shallow dent, where it had knocked against a stone altar in a ruined chapel. The slight curve near its base, not present when he received it, caused by heat from a house fire he had walked too near. He began to carve tiny symbols into it, almost invisible, along its underside. One for each district he had served, one for each person who had whispered thanks before dying, one for each child who had smiled through the mask's glassy eyes. These carvings were not ornate, they were simple, a leaf, a star, a cross, a wave. But they helped him remember. They reminded him that the cane, though distant, could also carry compassion. He once tapped a rhythm on the cane for a young boy, mimicking the beat of a lullaby. The boy, feverish and weak, began to hum along. His eyes fluttered, and for a few brief moments, the fear faded. The cane became a song. Another time, a woman asked him to place it across her husband's chest after he passed. "So, he knows a healer came," she said. "So he knows he wasn't alone." Alaric complied, laying the cane gently, reverently, as if it were a scepter in a fallen king's tomb. Not all saw the cane kindly. There were times, rare but real, when crowds gathered, in suspicion. They believed the doctors brought the plague, not cured it. Alaric had to hold his cane firmly then, not to strike, but to steady his breath. It gave him presence when his courage faltered. It gave him a line between what was his and what was theirs. By spring, the cane was as familiar to him as his own hand. He carried it always, even in sleep, resting it near his bedroll. Once he dreamed it was a tree, and from its branches hung bells, each one tolling softly in the wind, each note a voice he had heard and lost. He awoke weeping, the cane clutched. To his chest, it was just a stick, and yet it was more. It was distance, it was care, it was memory, held in wood. The walls of Aurelianum were ancient, stone laid by ancestors, worn smooth by centuries of rain and war and wind. They were meant to protect, to keep invaders out and peace within. But during the plague, new walls rose, unseen, unmeasured, yet more confining than stone. Isolation became the law of survival. At first it was physical. Quarantine zones were declared, and barriers erected hastily. Planks were nailed across alleyways, entire streets sealed behind gates. Guards stood watch, reluctant and grim, barring even the curious glance. Red flags were tied to homes where infection had been confirmed. No one entered, no one left. But the true walls, the ones Alaric saw grow each day, were within the people. Doors, once open to neighbours and friends, closed tightly with bolts and prayers. Windows that once bloomed with flower pots and laughter now bore scraps of linen, fluttering like surrender flags in the breeze. The city turned inward. Families, locked, together in fear, began to fray. Parents whispered in corners. Children cried silently under beds. Couples grew apart in shared silence. The very act of breathing near another became a thing of danger. Even love hesitated. Alaric, walking his solitary path, could feel the distance, growing in every gaze. When he knocked on a door, it no longer swung open with gratitude or pleading. Now it cracked, a sliver of eye and voice behind it. "What do you want?" "There's no one sick here." "Please, just leave us be." Sometimes, he heard nothing at all, just footsteps retreating into shadow. He began to leave notes instead, slipped under doors or nailed to posts. Simple words. "Be cautious. Boil your water. Burn yesterday's bedding. Pray if it helps." No one responded, but sometimes he noticed fresh herbs hung the next day, or ash scattered at thresholds. His words had been heard. That was enough. The sick, too, became isolated within isolation. When a family member fell ill, the others often sealed them in a separate room. Meals were left at the door, untouched, until hunger demanded. Conversations happened through walls, a child's voice muffled by timber, a mother's prayer whispered across a crack in the frame. Once, Alaric visited a home where a young boy sat outside his sister's door, reading aloud. He had propped a book on his knees, his voice trembling. "She likes stories," he said. "So I read them, even if she can't hear." Inside, Alaric found the girl already cold, but he said nothing. He let the boy read on, letting fiction keep her company just a little longer. Isolation turned grief inward. Funerals were no longer held. The churches had closed their doors, the bells too burdened with constant death. Bodies were carted away, in silence. Families stood behind shutters, watching their dead vanish with no last touch, no farewell hymn. Some turned to writing names in chalk on their doors. Others lit candles and left them to burn down alone. A few painted crosses on the walls inside their homes, not to mark contagion, but to remember who had once laughed beneath them. Even Alaric felt it. Though he walked the city daily, spoke to dozens each week, he was never more alone. He could no longer visit the baker, nor the old bookbinder who once told him stories of distant lands. The tavern he once frequented to hear ballads now sat shuttered, the sign above its door faded and tilting. His world was shrinking. He began speaking aloud to himself on long walks, not full conversations, but murmurs. South Lane smells of time today. Only 2 bells so far. That bird again, watching me. The sound of his own voice reminded him that he was still human. In his quarters, the silence became a second skin. The walls seemed to press inward, not in threat, but in suffocating stillness. He kept the window ajar even on cold nights, just to hear something, anything beyond his breath. He dreamed more often, dreams of halls with no doors, of mirrors that showed only fog, of walking through rooms filled with people who did not speak or see him. He would wake with the taste of ash in his mouth, his hands clutching the edge of his blanket like a lifeline. He missed touch. Even through gloves, even through cloth, he missed the feel of another's warmth, the shared presence that spoke without words. The world now was made of distance. The air itself was suspect. He remembered a time, long ago, when his daughter had fallen ill with fever. He had sat beside her for hours, hand resting on her forehead, whispering lullabies. He had kept her cool, fed her broth, waited for her breath to steady. She survived, and he remembered, even more clearly, the embrace she gave him after, the way her arms had circled his neck with pure, unafraid love. Now, no child would embrace him. No widow would touch his sleeve in gratitude. No friend would clasp his shoulder in weary solidarity. The mask, the cane, the robes, they protected him from more than disease. They shielded him from human closeness. Even the dying sometimes flinched when he approached. Alaric began to collect pebbles from the roads, smooth ones, flat and pale. He kept them in a bowl beside his journal, each one he picked up on a day when the silence felt especially sharp, when no one spoke to him, when no voice, no face met his gaze. By spring the bowl was full. He did not count them. He did not need to. He knew their weight. They were the weight of walls within walls. Eyes speak when mouths fall silent. Alaric had looked into thousands, some clouded with fever, others wide in terror, many already still. Each one carried a world, a flicker of memory and meaning behind the film of illness. It was in the eyes that he saw the plague most clearly, not just the sickness of the body, but of the soul, the fear, the isolation, the silent question that every pair seemed to ask, will I be remembered? There was no single gaze of death. It came in many forms. Some eyes were peaceful, resigned. These were often the old, those who had seen too much, whose hands had held too many funerals. They looked upon him not with panic, but with a sad nod, as if to say, "So, it is my turn." Alaric respected these most. He stayed longer by their bedsides. He whispered simple words. "You are not alone." Sometimes he sang softly, old hymns his mother had taught him. Then there were the eyes of the young, so bright, so full of unfinished longing. These were the hardest. They searched him desperately, not just for help, but for promise. They wanted to believe there was still time, that this wasn't their end. He had no words for them, only silence, only presence. One boy, barely 10, gripped, his gloved hand tightly, his eyes locked on Alaric's mask. "Will it hurt?" the boy asked. Alaric knelt beside him, letting the beak mask tilt just slightly, giving the illusion of closeness. "Only for a little while," he said softly, "and then it will stop." The boy nodded, closed his eyes, and never opened them again. Some eyes held anger. A priest who had denounced the plague as punishment for sin glared at Alaric as he succumbed, his gaze accusing. He had begged for his congregation to repent, and now, in his final moments, he believed he was being judged. "I did what I was told," he rasped. Alaric said nothing. He simply folded the man's hands over his chest, gave him the dignity he had denied others. There were eyes filled with confusion. These were often the ones who didn't realize they were dying. They asked where they were, what day it was, if they would be going home soon. He would answer with calming tones, not always the truth, but always gentleness. "It's morning," he would say. "The sun is rising." And in their last breath, some would smile, believing it. Perhaps it was kinder to give hope, even if it was a lie. There were also eyes that saw more than Alaric could understand. A woman once stared at him, without blinking, her lips moving silently. Her gaze drifted past him, toward a corner of the room. Alaric turned, but there was nothing there. "He's waiting," she whispered. "Who?" "My brother. He came to take me. He's standing there." Alaric looked again. Still, there was no one. She closed her eyes and exhaled with relief. He left the candle burning a little longer in her room that night. Not all dying eyes saw peace or people. Some stared at the ceiling, dry and unblinking, locked in terror, until the end. The plague could bring pain unlike any Alaric had seen before. Fevers that boiled the mind. Buboes that ruptured and bled. Seizures that came like storms. In those eyes, he saw the truth of helplessness. Not his, but theirs. They knew death was coming, and nothing, not the mask, not the cane, not even the prayers whispered by desperate loved ones, could stop it. Alaric once tried to close the eyes of a merchant woman, only to find them locked open, her jaw slackened, her body still, but the eyes would not yield. He placed 2 coins over them, a custom as old as the city. He did not believe in it, not fully, but it felt like the right thing. What startled him most over time was how familiar the faces became. In the early weeks, he remembered each patient, He could recall the curve of a cheek, the color of eyes, the pattern of a birthmark. But as the numbers grew, memory became blurred, eyes blurred. He feared forgetting, so he began to draw them. In his journal, alongside words, he sketched the shapes of eyes he could not bear to lose. A girl's long lashes, a boy's freckled brow, the faint crow's feet of a baker who always smiled even in death. He called it the gallery of gaze. Some nights he stared at the pages for hours, whispering. The names he remembered. When he had no names, he invented them. Mira, Thomas, Elaine, Rolf. As if by speaking them, he gave them passage to somewhere kinder. And sometimes he saw himself reflected in their eyes, especially in the final seconds, when pupils dilated and the world narrowed. He saw the glint of his own mask, the curved beak, the glass discs, the silhouette of the man they died watching. He wondered what they thought he was. A doctor, an omen, a raven come to carry them away. He began removing the mask more often, just for a moment, when the room was quiet and the person nearly gone. He let them see his real face, his tired eyes, his human grief. He wanted them to know that someone, anyone, saw them not as a number, not as a patient, but as a soul. One day, he looked into the eyes of a young woman and saw no fear, only gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. And she was gone. He carried her gaze with him for many days. In it, he saw himself not as a shadow, not as death, but as a witness. Someone who stayed, someone who remembered. In Aurelianum, as in many cities gripped by the plague, people feared not only the sickness, but what it might mean. When death arrived in waves and prayers brought no answers, the human mind turned inward, seeking blame, seeking cause, seeking someone or something to hold responsible. Rats were the first to be cursed. Alaric remembered the earliest warnings. He saw them scurrying through alleys, darting from barrel to gutter, their eyes glinting like onyx in torchlight. They were nothing new, companions of the city for generations. But now they were harbingers. Their presence was no longer ignored. It was condemned. People whispered of poison in their fur, of demons in their breath. Children threw stones, and old men set traps lined with pitch and vinegar. Dead rats were hung from windows, nailed to doors, left in streets as offerings of warning. Some believed killing a rat might save a soul. Others thought it only drew the sickness nearer. The truth, Alaric did not know. He had read once, in the crumbling pages of a foreign manuscript, that fleas carried the plague, not rats themselves. But such ideas were foreign to most, and fear does not wait for evidence. Still, he took note. Where rats multiplied, death often followed. But it was not just the animals that suffered blame. Rumours spread like fire in a dry field. They spoke of strangers arriving before the outbreak began, of merchants who brought cursed goods, of women who prayed too often beneath the moonlight, of wells poisoned by foreign hands, of healers, yes, even healers, who trafficked in forbidden arts, who fed on death like crows. Alaric heard it whispered at first. He wears the beak to hide his horns. He does not age. He comes to claim, not to cure. He knew such talk was old as time. When fear takes root, superstition blooms. One afternoon, he passed a crowd gathered near the fish market. A boy was being held by the collar, shaken, by a furious butcher. "He spat on the church door," the man roared. "He brought it here," the boy cried, terrified, pleading. Alaric stepped in. Cain held firm. "Let him go." The crowd hesitated. The mask, the robe, the quiet authority. It still meant something. The butcher snarled. "He mocked the saints." Alaric turned to the boy. "Did you?" The boy shook his head, wide-eyed. "I was looking for my cat. That was enough." He escorted the boy away, his hand resting gently on the shoulder. Behind him, The mutters grew, but they did not follow. Later that night, he found a small statue of Saint Aurelian, broken on the church steps. Fear turned even sacred things into kindling. Another time, a woman was brought to him in secret. She was a midwife, known for her quiet kindness. But someone had accused her of cursing infants, of causing miscarriages with a glance. She prays in a foreign tongue, they said. She knows herbs too well. Alaric examined her. There was no illness, only tremors from fear and sleeplessness. He told her to rest, gave her a pouch of rosemary for strength. He wrote in his journal that night, "It is not always the plague that kills. Sometimes it is the crowd." The city began to fracture. People began accusing one another. Neighbors once close grew cold. A man who shared bread in spring might be blamed in summer. A woman who offered help might be cursed by autumn. Alaric walked among them, silent, listening. He saw signs chalked on walls, arrows pointing toward unclean homes. He saw offerings left at crossroads, bundles of hair, feathers, crushed berries, protective charms or curses. Even within the guild, whispers stirred. Some blamed the water from the southern cistern. Others blamed the sky, the alignment of stars, the darkening of the moon. Alaric stayed silent. He knew the truth was not what they wanted. They wanted simplicity, a cause, a target. He began to mark such rumors in a separate ledger, not for science, but for sorrow, a record of blame. He called it the Book of Shadows. In it, he wrote, "Today they blamed the olive merchant. Yesterday they blamed the baker's apprentice. Tomorrow, perhaps, they will blame the silence itself." He did not show this book to anyone, but he read from it often. It reminded him how fragile society could be, how thin the line between belief and brutality, how quickly a city of stone could turn into a wilderness of suspicion. And yet, among the rumors, there were moments of clarity. A priest who stood before a mob and said, "We do not know who brought this, but we know who we are. Let us not lose that too." A group of mothers who formed a circle around a sick child, shielding her from angry hands. A man who returned each day to clean the chapel steps, even when no one came to pray. Alaric saw these too, wrote them down, called them flickers. In darkness, even a flicker mattered. He continued his rounds, mask on, cane steady, robes stiff with ash and time. He greeted the fearful, treated the accused, listened to the cursed. He remained neutral, but not indifferent. He remembered every name whispered in fear, every kindness drowned in suspicion. Because while the plague took bodies, rumors took souls. And the city, to survive, needed both. It came every morning, just after the first bell rang, the cart. Its wheels creaked with a rhythm older than sorrow, pulled slowly by a gaunt mule whose ribs showed through its hide like the lines on a map. The cartman was always the same man, though none knew his name. Wrapped in a heavy hood and scarf, he never spoke, never paused longer than needed. He was called, simply, the bearer. To Alaric, the cart was both a presence and a punctuation. It marked the end of life and the beginning of forgetting. Everybody it carried was someone who had once laughed, once sung, once told stories to children, or shared bread with friends, and now they lay upon splintered boards, side by side, motionless. At first, the cart came once per day, then twice, then all through the day and into the night, its wheels groaning under the weight of loss. Alaric came to know its sound from a distance, the low, uneven rumble on cobbled streets. When he heard it, he paused, not from fear, but from reverence. The dead deserved at least that much. People learned to listen for it too. They would step aside as it passed, eyes downcast. Some made the sign of the cross. Others turned their backs. A few whispered names, hoping to see a loved one again, even in stillness. The bearer never acknowledged them. He simply lifted the bodies, sometimes with help from family, more often alone, and arranged them with as much dignity as the moment allowed. If the corpse was wrapped in linen, he adjusted it. If it was bare, he covered it with his own cloak until the next home. He was a gentleman, though hidden behind layers of wool and silence. Alaric once walked beside him from the southern quarter to the burial pit beyond the city walls. They did, and not speak. But in that quiet procession, there was a strange peace. They reached the trench, freshly dug and already half filled. A priest stood nearby, murmuring last rites with a voice hoarse from overuse. He did not pause for names. There were too many. Alaric helped lift the bodies, one by one. Each time he whispered a phrase. Not always the same, but always gentle. Safe journey. You were loved. Be remembered. No one told him to say these words. But they helped. They helped him. The pit itself was a vast wound in the earth. Dug by prisoners, supervised by soldiers, it grew wider each week. The bodies were laid in rows, separated by lime and soil. No gravestones marked their rest, no flowers, no names. Alaric began carving initials into small pieces of bark, leaving them in his satchel after each visit. It was a futile ritual, but he could not stop. Once he saw a mother place a ribbon in her daughter's hand before she was taken to the cart. "So she'll know she was mine," she said. The bearer nodded and did not remove it. Another time, a man refused to let go of his wife's body. He clung to her, weeping openly in the street. The neighbors watched, silent, unsure. Alaric approached, not with force, but with time. He waited beside the man until the tears slowed, until the arms loosened. "Shall we walk with her?" Alaric asked, and together they walked behind the cart. There were days when the cart overflowed, when the bodies had to be stacked. Those were the hardest days. Alaric did not write about them. He could not. The city tried to keep up. More carts were built, more bearers hired. But the roads grew heavy with the scent of death. Even the animals grew restless. Birds avoided the rooftops. Dogs howled without reason. The dead became routine. That, more than anything, unsettled Alaric. To become accustomed to death was a kind of forgetting. He fought against it in small ways. He tied sprigs of rosemary to the cart's corners. He asked the bearer once if he minded music. The man did not reply, but he did not object when Alaric hummed softly as they walked. A song without words, a memory without name. The cart, over time, began to decay. The boards cracked. The wheels needed mending. The mule grew slower, but still, it came. Every day. It did not stop. It was more than wood and iron. It was the city's heartbeat, slow and mournful. When spring finally arrived, the cart still rolled. But now, the load was lighter. The bells tolled less often. The air smelled of blossoms again, faintly, but the cart did not forget. It continued, quieter now, as if in mourning for the silence left behind. Alaric watched it pass one morning and felt a strange ache in his chest. A sadness, not for the dead, but for the part of the city that had died with them. The part that had once danced, once sang, once gathered in taverns and fields. The cart had carried more than bodies. It had carried away laughter and story and song, and Alaric, in his quiet way, had walked behind it all the while. Hunger during the plague was not the sharp hunger of famine, nor the hunger of empty granaries and withered crops. It was a quieter sort, fading, unsettling, a hunger shaped by fear and fatigue rather than emptiness. In the beginning, there was bread. Bakers worked early before the sun rose, their ovens glowing like distant hearths of hope. The scent of flour and yeast, once a common comfort, became rare. Those who could afford it queued at dawn, keeping their distance, eyes darting nervously. Coins exchanged hands wrapped in cloth. Words were few. But as the plague spread, even the bakers fell silent. Some closed their shops and vanished into the countryside. Others stayed and worked until their ovens burned cold. Alaric remembered one such man, Joran, whose sourdough was known for its crisp crust and honey-sweet interior. One morning, Alaric found his door open, the fire out, the house silent. The dough on the counter had risen beautifully. It was never baked. Soon, food was no longer shared. Communal meals disappeared. No more stews simmering in large pots over central fires. No more platters passed from hand to hand. Eating became private, furtive. People cooked only for themselves or their sick. The markets became still. Where once there had been shouting, bargaining, laughter, now there were only eyes peering over carts and quiet exchanges done without touch. Meat vanished first. Too risky, too rare. Then fresh vegetables. Only dried lentils, old barley, pickled onions, and root vegetables remained. Alaric observed the change with quiet resignation. He too adapted. His meals became simpler. Stale rye softened with broth. Apples turned soft with bruising. Water flavored faintly with rosemary or mint when it could be spared. He fasted often, not by choice, but by rhythm. The days were long. Returning to his quarters, he often lacked the strength or will to cook. Sometimes he lit a candle, opened a wrapped bundle of cheese, and simply stared at it, untouched. He kept a small tin box where he stored bits of dried pear and crushed walnut, not for nutrition, but for memory. They reminded him of a feast once shared with his wife and daughter on a spring hillside, years before the plague. They had laughed over wine, torn fresh bread with their hands, eaten olives from a shared plate. He never opened the box. He only held it. The sick ate little. Some refused food entirely, their stomachs too twisted with pain or fever. Others tried, but could not keep it down. Alaric brought broth when he could. Simple, bland, soothing. He had a small pot that travelled with him, filled each morning. At the guild's kitchen, he remembered one girl, young, with skin pale as milk, who requested honey on her bread. Alaric had none. The next day, he found a merchant who traded him a spoonful in exchange for treating his sick wife. He brought it to the girl the same afternoon. She died before he could give it to her. The honey remained in his satchel for weeks, untouched, until one evening he stirred it into his tea and whispered her name with the first sip. Some asked for final meals, tokens of comfort, of farewell. A soldier begged for salted pork, a weaver for her mother's barley stew, a child for candied almonds. Alaric tried to grant these requests when possible, though often they came too late. He began writing these requests in his journal. Alricus, pork, Mara, sweet wine, Nico, egg yolk with honey, simple fleeting wishes. Most were never fulfilled. But to write them down was to honour the wanting. There were days when the city seemed to forget to eat altogether. Alaric would walk a whole street and smell nothing. No smoke, no spice, no bread. It was as if appetite had withered with hope. Fasting became common, not for piety, but for practicality. The sick could not cook. The living were too few. In monasteries, even the monks rationed their oats and foraged for greens among the graveyards. One friar told Alaric, "We do not eat to live anymore. We eat not to die." That same man later died of exhaustion. Some turned to herbs, nettles, dandelions, wild garlic. A few made tea from dried apple peels or a weak broth from old bones. Alaric came to admire their resourcefulness, their quiet, dignity. They made do, not out of choice, but out of survival. And yet, there were still small miracles. Once, he was invited into a home by a woman who insisted on feeding him. She had lost her husband, her children, her parents, all in the space of a month. Yet she offered him warm lentils and a single boiled egg. "I eat so I can remember how," she said softly. He thanked her, and that night wrote only one sentence. In his journal, "She reminded me that sharing is an act of courage." Toward the end of the season, when the bells grew less frequent and the air no longer stank of burning flesh, the ovens lit once more. Not all, but some. A bakery reopened, its door wide. A boy sold radishes by the bridge. A pot of stew bubbled over a fire near the eastern wall, and Alaric was offered a bowl. He accepted. He tasted rosemary and bay leaf, a hint of meat, a soft turnip, and something else, something hard to name. Maybe it was hope. He ate slowly, as if afraid to lose it. The ink dried before the words reached their destination. In the plague years, letters became ghosts. They carried love and longing, fear and farewell. Yet most never found the hands they were meant for. They were tucked into pockets, hidden beneath mattresses, buried with the dead. They were never read. Alaric collected them, not as a collector of curiosities, but as a witness. Each letter he found, he read, quietly, respectfully. He did not always understand the handwriting. Some were written in trembling lines, others in bold, hurried script. Some were little more than smudge stains, but all were written with hope. First he found lay beside the bed of a dying man. The parchment was stained, the words faint. "My dearest Ellis, the fever is worse today. I dream of your face and the scent of marjoram in your hair. If this letter finds you, remember the spring by the river." Alice, wherever she was, never read it. Alaric folded the letter and placed it in his satchel. He would do the same for dozens more. Some were addressed to spouses, others to children or parents. A few were meant for friends, or priests, or employers. A handful were never addressed at all, simply written and left in drawers or pinned to door frames, like charms against forgetting. He came to recognize certain phrases. "If you find this, I don't know if you're still alive. Forgive me. I'm sorry I couldn't wait." The letters revealed lives that the plague had silenced. A merchant confessing lost coins. A mother thanking her daughter for singing to her. A young man apologizing for a broken promise. A child asking if her dog would find her in heaven. Alaric kept them in a wooden box, which he lined with soft cloth and dried lavender. He called it the Quiet Archive. He never let anyone else touch it. He tried sometimes to respond. One evening, he found a letter clutched in a dead woman's hand. It read, "To Anna, tell your brother I forgive him. Tell him I remember the apple tree and the song we sang when the sky turned red. There was no surname, no house number, just Anna." Alaric wrote a response on parchment and tacked it to the chapel door. "Anna, your mother forgave him. She remembered the song. She loved you both. He didn't know if anyone would see it, but it felt necessary. The city's scribes, those who had once written contracts and copied sermons, now copied names for death registries. Still, a few continued to write letters for others, for those too weak, too illiterate, or too afraid. Alaric sometimes sat with the dying and offered to write their final messages. They dictated slowly, their voices trembling. "Tell him, I never stopped loving him. Tell them, I forgive the debt. Tell her, I saw the sea in my dream." He did not correct grammar or spelling. He simply wrote what they said exactly. He kept these letters in a second bundle, wrapped in a red ribbon. He meant to deliver them when the plague passed, but often there was no one left to receive them. Some letters were written to God. They were prayers in disguise, pleas for mercy, for healing, for understanding. "I lit 3 candles. I gave what I had. Please, don't take my son. I was never a good woman, but please, let me die first so they don't suffer alone. If you exist, let there be something after." Alaric did not judge. He read them all. He added them to his collection. One particularly cold morning, he found a bundle of letters tied with twine, placed carefully beneath the statue of St. Bastian. Each one began the same way. To the one who finds this. Each one ended differently. I'm sorry, I couldn't stay. Please tell them I tried. Remember me when the bells stop. He wept reading those letters, not for the words themselves, but for the silence they were born into. The plague had made the city quiet, but it had not made it voiceless. Alaric sometimes read the letters aloud, alone in his room. He did not change his tone. He read them gently, respectfully, as if those who wrote them sat across from him, listening. He once read a letter to the wind, standing atop the city wall. To anyone, please. Don't let my name be forgotten. He spoke the name, Isolde Mera. He let it fly into the dusk. There were letters that remained unfinished, parchment with one sentence, ink stopped mid-word, pens fallen beside trembling hands. He kept these too. They spoke as loudly as the others. He dreamed sometimes of building a wall of letters, each one pressed beneath glass, each one a window into a life lived, loved, and lost. But the city had no museum now, no library, no place for remembrance, not yet. So he kept them with him, not to read them again, but to carry the weight of memory. One letter, unsigned, read simply, "If someone reads this, then I was real." Alaric folded it with care. "You were," he whispered. At first, no one noticed the silence. It arrived gradually, like the hush after snowfall, or the stillness in a room where someone has just left. One morning, Alaric stood at his window, sipping water warmed by the hearth, and realized something was missing. The bells had not rung, not once. He set down his cup and listened more intently. The city was not quiet. There were distant sounds, faint and cautious. A door creaking open, a child's laugh carried on the breeze, the cooing of pigeons nesting beneath the eaves. But the bells, always present, were absent. It had been nearly a year since they had stopped for even a day. Alaric kept to his routine. He dressed slowly, methodically, mask, gloves, cane, and stepped into the street, unsure whether it was a mistake. Maybe the bell ringer had fallen ill. Maybe the ropes had frayed. But as he walked his rounds, he saw signs. Windows were open, again, even if just a crack. A woman was sweeping her doorstep. A dog barked with energy, chasing a fluttering scrap of cloth. A boy played with a spinning top on the stones, watched nervously by his mother. These small things, ordinary once, now shimmered with meaning. In the southern quarter, he passed the apothecary's shop and found its shuttered door propped open, the familiar smell of mint and fennel drifting into the air. A sign read, "Returning soon, with hope." Alaric said nothing. He continued. At noon, the bell tolled once. A single, low note. Not the funereal chime of death, but a longer, steadier sound. The kind that called for gathering, or prayer, or simply noticing. It echoed through the lanes like the breath of the city itself. In the days that followed, he counted. The numbers were changing. Where once he had visited 10, 20, even 30 homes a day, now there were only 3 or 4. Some of those were for check-ins, not illness. A cough here, a fever there, nothing like before. At the burial pit, the cart arrived only once that week. The bearer gave Alaric a quiet nod as he passed, an acknowledgement not of triumph but of endurance. No one dared say the word end. It felt dangerous, too bold, but the signs grew stronger. A tavern lit its lantern again, even though no guests entered. A church door creaked open, and 2 elderly women stepped inside with hands folded. A young couple held hands in the square, masks still on, but fingers entwined. Alaric continued his work. He did not remove the mask, not yet. He still carried his satchel, still burned rosemary each evening. But inside, something stirred. A warmth that had lain dormant for so long, He had nearly forgotten its shape. The silence, which once threatened to suffocate, now felt like breath, space, possibility. The guild held its first meeting in 3 months. Only 5 doctors remained. The others were gone, some fled, some buried. They spoke quietly, reviewing notes, updating records. Alaric said little, but when asked if he believed the plague had loosened its grip, he nodded. Slower than it came, he said. But yes. He walked the city not in fear now, but in reflection. He revisited places from the early days. The house with the red door, the garden where the harp girl once played, the bridge where he'd shared stew with the mournful father. These places were still, changed, but standing. The oak behind the apothecaries was blooming. One morning, he removed the mask. He did it slowly, not in ceremony, but with care. He stood alone beneath a wide elm, outside the city's north gate. The wind was soft, brushing his cheeks like a forgotten blessing. He took a breath, not through filters or linen or herb-scented cloth, but clean and full. He wept quietly. He let the tears fall freely, not for pain, but for release. The next day, he wore the mask again, not because he feared, but because the city still watched him. Some still needed the image of the doctor, the shape of safety. But now, he allowed himself moments without it. Brief intervals of sun on his skin, of wind in his hair. He visited the guild archive and offered his journals. The Book of Shadows, the Gallery of Gaze, the Quiet Archive. He placed them in the hands of the last librarian, whose beard had grown wild and white. "They are not official," Alaric said. "They are human," the librarian replied. Alaric returned to the southern quarter and found that the girl who once played the harp had planted onions along her doorstep. She looked healthier. She smiled. He left her a small bag of dried fruit. In the square, someone played a lute again. The song was clumsy, the notes uneven, but no one minded. A few children danced, shyly at first, then with growing boldness. A vendor sold figs. A widow offered fresh bread in exchange for a poem. Life, thin and unsure, returned. Alaric walked among it quietly, cane tapping with new rhythm. Not all returned. Too many doors remained shut forever. Too many names would never be spoken again. But those who lived, those who had waited, endured, hoped, they began to stretch toward the light again. The bells no longer tolled for death. Instead, one rang at dusk each evening, a single, solemn chime, not as mourning, but as memory. Alaric listened from his window, eyes closed, hand resting gently on his mask. He did not smile. He simply breathed. Survivors did not emerge into light as heroes. They did not shout or sing or declare themselves victors. They stepped out of their homes slowly, eyes blinking in the softened sun, bodies thinner, hands cautious. They looked about as if stepping into a world that no longer knew them, and in truth it didn't, not entirely. Alaric watched them each morning, moving through streets that had once been hollow. Life returned in small, deliberate gestures. A man opened his shutters and watered a potted thyme plant. A woman stitched a new hem on a faded dress. A child drew circles in dust with a stick. They were not the same people they had been. Each one bore the imprint of loss. Some carried it in their silence, others in the way they flinched when bells rang too loudly. Some moved with slowed limbs, as though carrying unseen weights. Many had no family left. Some no friends. Some had even forgotten how to speak without whispering. Yet they lived. The survivors became their own kind of congregation, not organized by faith or kinship, but by shared endurance. They met in small clusters, sitting in open courtyards or quiet corners of churches. They did not speak much, but their presence near one another mattered. Alaric did not always join them. He observed from a distance, writing in his journal what he saw. A baker handed a roll to a boy without charge. 3 old men played dice in silence, only the clatter of bone on stone speaking. A woman lit a candle, then another, then another. Not for ceremony, just to see them glow. These, he believed, were the rights of the living. Some survivors tried to rebuild what had been. Shopkeepers reopened stores. The Weavers' Guild began restocking yarns, though in fewer colors. A carpenter repaired broken doors, leaving tiny carvings of leaves near each handle as his quiet signature. Others could not go back. A teacher refused to re-enter her schoolroom. Too many children had vanished from the benches. She instead began teaching one child at a time, outside, beneath a linden tree. The children came barefoot, books in cloth satchels. They recited slowly, softly. The tree became a school of its own. The city walls, once symbols of protection, now felt like borders of sorrow. Beyond them, some had fled during the height of the plague. A few returned, others did not. Those who came back found their homes overtaken by weeds or memories. One man, seeing his empty house, built a bench instead and sat beside the ruins, offering stories to those who passed. He told of festivals, of music in the square, of a wedding that once spilled through the streets like a river of joy. Alaric listened to him one afternoon. "Do you remember it?" the man asked. "I remember the music," Alaric said. They sat together in silence for a while. Children who had lost parents became wards of the city. Alaric saw them often, eyes too old for their years, speaking in short, precise phrases. They played differently now, no longer wild games, but careful ones. Arranging stones, stacking sticks, braiding strings. Quiet games. Games of order in a world that had broken. He gave them paper once and charcoal. They drew not faces, but houses. Rows of windows, fences, rooms with beds and bowls. They drew what they missed. Not all survivors remained kind. Some grew bitter, their grief turning inward. They hoarded supplies. They distrusted strangers. They questioned who deserved to live. Some whispered that the sick should have been turned away earlier, that certain districts should never have been aided. Alaric noted this too. Survival did not always mean healing, but most carried on not in anger, but in fatigue. They wore their scars like worn shoes, visible but necessary. There was no shame in limping. In time, the city began to clean itself. Ash was swept, doorways were scrubbed, wells were blessed again. Paint returned to walls. Songs, at first tentative, echoed down narrow lanes. A woman sang while hanging linens. A boy whistled on a rooftop. A group of farmers clapped in rhythm while lifting crates. These sounds were soft, but sacred. Alaric sat near the fountain one afternoon and closed his eyes. He heard the splash of water, the murmur of conversation, the clink of metal being shaped by the blacksmith. Each sound felt like a heartbeat. He did not speak of the dead that day. He simply listened to the living. In the evenings, candles flickered in windows, not as warnings, but as welcomes. Neighbors left bowls of stew at each other's doors. Bread was broken again. Hands shared cups. Eyes met without flinching. And yet, for each act of renewal, a shadow lingered. People hesitated before laughing too loudly. They looked over shoulders before dancing in the square. They remembered. Alaric believed this was not a flaw. To remember, he thought, was not to dwell in pain, but to carry truth forward. He began writing a new journal. He called it the Book of the Living. In it, he described not symptoms or sorrow, but survival. Eleanor reopened her stall. She sells dried herbs and braids them with ribbon. 2 boys carried an old man to the chapel for the first mass in months. A girl kissed her mother's cheek and said, "I still love your stories." He filled pages quickly, not because the city was healed, but because it had chosen to try. That, to Alaric, was the difference. To survive was not merely to avoid death. It was to light a candle, even when the wind still howled. Not all who died were granted a resting place. There were too many and too few hands to dig. In the earliest days, The dead were laid in shallow graves, wrapped in whatever cloth could be spared. A priest would speak a prayer. Neighbors might bow their heads. A handful of soil would fall like a final whisper. But as the numbers grew, the customs fell away. The pits became mass graves, long trench-like cavities dug by those strong enough, desperate enough, or paid enough to do the work. Alaric remembered them well, the smell, the silence, the eyes that avoided his as the bodies were rolled in. But there were always more. And not all found their way to those pits. Some died in hidden corners, in alleyways behind markets, in the lofts of abandoned homes, beneath bridges where no one dared to walk. Others perished in fields beyond the city, too far from help, too isolated for discovery. Alaric found them sometimes. Not often, but enough to remember each one. A boy curled behind barrels near the docks, arms around a small dog that had long since gone still. A girl in a cellar, clutching a doll. An old man on the cathedral steps, leaning as if still in prayer. He recorded them all in a ledger he called The Unburied. He didn't include names, there were none. Instead, he wrote what he saw. Wore a red scarf, eyes closed, hands folded, left boot missing, bruises on knuckles, died clutching a purse, hair braided with lavender, dress stitched by hand, smile faint, but there. He remembered the way each space felt when he entered. Some were heavy with stillness. Others had a breeze or light from a broken roof, or the soft murmur of water dripping nearby. All were places that had once known life. Alaric did what he could. He closed their eyes, covered their forms, whispered words, even if no one could hear them. Sometimes he returned with candles, placing them beside the bodies until he could arrange for burial. But not all could be moved. There were places too narrow, too dangerous, too forgotten. He marked these on a map, drawn by hand, kept secret, not out of shame, but reverence. These, he wrote, are the places where memory lingers. In time, others found the unburied too. Children playing in rubble. Farmers tilling the edge of the city. Builders clearing space for repair. The discoveries were met with quiet rituals. A cloth laid over bone. A prayer murmured. A stone placed. To mark. No grand ceremonies. Just gestures. There were no longer enough priests to tend to every soul. The city, in its grief, became its own clergy. Each citizen a mourner. Each neighbour a keeper of the dead. And yet, even amid the sorrow, there was grace. Alaric once witnessed a group of women gathering flowers, dandelions, violets, small white clover, and weaving them into garlands. They placed them gently at the edge of a field where 20 had been buried together, hurriedly without names. They did not speak as they worked. They only sang, a low hum, like the wind through trees. He watched from afar. When they left, he approached and added a feather from his mask to one of the garlands. The forgotten had not been forgotten, not entirely. There were tales, too, of those who buried their own in secret, behind homes, beneath trees, inside walls. They left tokens, a ring, a shoe, a lock of hair. These graves were not registered, not recorded, but they were real. The city, over time, would build upon them, stone upon stone, brick over earth. But beneath it all, the unburied remained. Alaric did not see this as tragedy alone. To him, these hidden graves were like roots, quiet, unseen, but supporting the life above. He wrote in his final entry in The Unburied, "Not every grave has a stone, not every name has a voice, but the earth remembers." He placed the book inside a clay jar, sealed it with wax, and buried it himself, beneath the old olive tree behind the library ruins. No one saw him do it. He didn't need them to. Some nights, in the seasons that followed, he walked paths he had once avoided. The alleys, the edges, the broken steps. He He felt the presence of those who had not been laid to rest with ceremony, but whose spirits clung gently to the places where they last breathed. He greeted them softly, not as ghosts, but as companions. He left small gifts, a sprig of thyme, a folded scrap of parchment with a drawing, a copper coin pressed into the soil. He imagined that if one listened carefully, one might hear them sigh, not in sorrow, but in remembrance. The mask had become more than protection. It was identity. It was silence. It was distance measured in leather and glass. For Alaric, the plague doctor's mask had been his second face for so long that he had forgotten the feel of wind across his bare cheeks. He had worn it faithfully, day after day, through smoke and sorrow, through streets thick with mourning, through prayers whispered behind doors he would never open again. But the time had come, not by decree, not by ceremony, but by instinct. One morning, as the bells chimed only once and the market hummed with hesitant voices, Alaric sat on a low wall near the edge of the square. The sunlight filtered through the trees like a benediction, and the breeze was kind. A child walked by and paused to look at him. The boy smiled, waved, and said, "You don't look so scary anymore." It was then that Alaric realized he was not wearing the mask. He had forgotten to put it on. He reached to touch his face and felt only skin, warm, weathered, real. The mask lay beside him on the stone, its beak curved downward like a bird at rest. The boy's mother called him gently, and the child scampered off. But Alaric remained still. He picked up the mask slowly, turning it in his hands. The leather was cracked in places. The straps had loosened. Inside, the familiar scent of lavender, vinegar, and dust lingered faintly. He remembered the first time he had worn it, how heavy it had felt, how alien, how it had altered not just how he was seen, but how he saw. For months, he had only glimpsed the world through twin glass circles, a world distorted, dimmed. Now, the clarity was startling. He looked around. He saw the faces of people, eyes tired, but open. He saw colours, aprons dyed with wine and berry, banners fluttering above reopened shops, petals of early roses. He saw smiles, small, uncertain, but unmistakable. To be seen was a quiet revelation. In the days that followed, Alaric wore the mask less and less. He carried it sometimes in a satchel or beneath his cloak, but no longer upon his face. He did not discard it. It had earned its place. But he no longer needed to hide. The first time he entered a home without it, he paused at the threshold. The woman inside, a widow named Brianna, looked up in surprise. "You're different," she said. "I am," he replied. He helped her lift a rug, mend a shutter, light her hearth. They shared a bowl of broth. She asked him about his work, and he answered plainly, without the echo of the beak to veil his voice. She smiled. "You have kind eyes. I wondered what your voice was like." That evening, he wrote in his journal, "The mask protected me, but it also kept me from being remembered." For many, the mask had come to symbolize both safety and sorrow. Children had drawn it in chalk, in charcoal, even in mud. Some saw it as a creature of nightmares, others as a silent angel. Some had never known his face, only the silhouette, the steps, the shadow. When he removed it in public for the first time, truly removed it, in the square, before the fountain, a hush fell over the crowd. Not fear, not shock, but quiet recognition. He was not a ghost, not a bird, not a spectre. He was a man, wrinkles beneath his eyes, lines of fatigue, a smile that tried, even when uncertain. A boy approached, holding a folded drawing, a picture of the beaked mask, standing beside a bright sun. "Is this still you?" he asked. Alaric knelt beside him. "It was me," he said, "and it still is. But now I have another face." He turned the paper over and drew a simple face, his own, round and plain, with deep-set eyes and a gentle smile. The boy laughed. "I like this one better." As more doctors removed their masks, a kind of slow rehumanization began. The people began to speak of them by name, no longer just plague men or crow masks, but Alaric, Thomas, Elira, Joran. They became part of the city again, not figures of dread, but neighbors. Still, Alaric kept the mask in a place of honor. He hung it on the wall above his writing desk, beneath a sprig of rosemary. He did not worship it. He did not despise it. He regarded it with quiet gratitude. It had allowed him to serve, to endure, to hide when hiding was needed. But now, there was light. One afternoon, he was invited to a gathering in the garden behind the chapel. Survivors, doctors, clergy, merchants. There was food, laughter, music played softly on a lute. People spoke in gentle tones, not of tragedy, but of what came next. A girl brought a basket of flowers and handed one to each person. When she came to Alaric, she paused. "No mask," she said, eyes wide. He smiled and nodded. She gave him a daisy. "Now we know what your face looks like when you smile." He held the flower gently, as if it were a blessing. That night, he wrote a final line in the margins of his journal. Long after the bells had quieted and the carts had stopped, dust remained. It gathered not only in the streets, but in the corners of every memory, every doorway, every thought left half-spoken during the long dark. Dust on windowsills, on pews in empty churches, on doorknobs that hadn't been turned in months. Cleaning the city was not just a matter of sweeping floors or scrubbing walls. It was an act of courage. Alaric understood this the moment he was asked to help restore the infirmary. It had once been a place of healing, modest beds lined with linen, shelves of herbs and ointments, a quiet corner for prayer. Now it was still. The air smelled of stale water and mold. The floors were stained. Cobwebs hung like ghosts between the beams. He was not alone in this work. A dozen survivors had gathered, former patients, widows, orphans, even one baker who had lost his entire family but chose to stay. None were strong. All bore the signs of loss, but they carried brooms, pails, rags. They began without speaking. The first cloth dipped into the soapy water made a sound like breath. They wiped the walls. They cleared the ash from the hearth. They lit the windows so the sun could enter freely. It was not fast work. It was not loud, but it was sacred. Every rag wrung dry was a small rite. Every broken stool mended was a declaration. We are still here. Alaric swept quietly. He found under one bed a bundle of papers, notes left by a healer who had vanished in the early weeks. Names, symptoms, sketches. He read them gently and placed them in a wooden box marked "To Remember." In another room, he opened a chest and found a child's toy, wooden, simple, shaped like a horse. He did not take it. He dusted it and placed it on the windowsill. Some corners were harder. Behind the altar, they found blood, old, dry, but unmistakable. No one asked whose. A woman knelt and washed the stone carefully, then lit a small candle and left it burning. The dust seemed to retreat in silence. Elsewhere in the city, other hands worked. At the chapel, old hymns were sung as pews were polished, not in full voice, not yet, but as a whisper of return. At the bathhouse, fresh water was poured for the first time in many months. The warmth filled the rooms with steam, and the scent of rosemary oil drifted through the air like a forgotten song. At the school, children helped repaint the walls, laughing when the paint dripped on their clothes. Alaric watched them from the street. The sound of laughter had once felt distant. Now it felt strange, but welcome. In his own quarters, he began to clean too. He folded the spare robes, washed the herbs stored in jars, swept beneath his bed. He opened the windows wide. The breeze carried in the scent of blooming elderflower. and turned the pages of his journal. He picked up the mask, dusted it gently, and placed it in a wooden box lined with wool. He did not seal it. He left it slightly open, as if it might still be needed. He burned his last candle from winter, letting the wax drip slowly into a clay bowl. He wrote, "Dust remains even when death has left. It carries the shape of memory, but we do not live in memory alone. Some homes remained untouched. Too many had no one left to clean them. These houses sat in quiet decay, windows broken, doors ajar, floors warped from rain." Alaric passed them slowly, noting which might yet be saved. Some were taken in by neighbours, others became gardens, plants growing through floorboards, birds nesting in rafters. Nature, too, cleaned in its way. He once found a garden overtaken by wildflowers. No one had planted them. They had simply come, carried by wind or bird, growing in the cracks left behind. He sat there for a time, among the flowers, listening to bees. Cleaning was not always restoration. Sometimes it meant letting go. A woman gave Alaric a bundle of clothes, her husband's, now too painful to keep. He folded them gently, placed them in the fire, and stood with her as the smoke curled upward. When she cried, he said nothing. He placed a hand on her shoulder and let her lean. Not all dust could be swept. There were dreams, strange, half-remembered, fragments of sorrow that lingered in quiet moments. The creak of a step, the sound of a cough, the sight of an empty chair. These could not be cleaned, but they could be carried. The city, week by week, became brighter, not perfect, but open. A boy began sweeping the chapel steps each morning. Woman planted lavender outside the bakery. An old man repainted the bench in the square with a careful hand. They did not speak of cleaning as duty. They spoke of it as return. One evening, Alaric wrote, "Dust in the corners is not a sign of defeat. It is a sign of having lived." He closed his book and placed a sprig of mint between its pages, and then he slept, deeply, without the mask near his bed, without the candle burning late. The city breathed, and so did he. Before the plague, Aurelianum had known joy. Each season brought a festival, carefully prepared, deeply cherished. The spring bloom in March, when garlands were hung from every door and children paraded through the streets in flower crowns. The summer fire in July, with music and dancing, lanterns floating down the river. The harvest revel in October, where carts overflowed with apples, grain and laughter. And of course wintertide, when the city was draped in candlelight, and even the poorest household kept a loaf of sweet bread by the hearth. But when the plague came, the music stopped. No parades, no songs, no dancing, no reason to gather, no safety in closeness. The banners stayed rolled, the instruments silent. The stages, long prepared for travelling players and town storytellers, stood bare and dusted. The cloth tents of merchants and sweet sellers never rose again. Fountains that once bubbled with coloured water stood still, their basins cracked from frost and neglect. Alaric missed the festivals not for their spectacle, but for their rhythm. They had marked time. They gave people something to count on, something to look forward to. They reminded the city that joy was not frivolous. It was survival's companion. That year, there had been no spring bloom. The city had been too frightened. Children had stayed indoors, eyes watching the lanes from behind curtains. Flowers, left unpicked, bloomed and withered on the vine. Alaric walked the streets quietly, remembering years past. Laughter, music, the scent of sugared almonds in the air. Now there was only the creak of carts and the low murmur of the sick. The summer fire passed in silence. No lanterns floated down the river, no flutes or drums, no ribbons, only the smoke from funeral pyres rising thick into the sky. Even the sun seemed dimmer. The harvest revel was marked by ration lines and whispered prayers. There was no feast, no toasts, only a thin barley porridge and the sound of bells. Alaric remembered standing in the square alone that evening, watching leaves tumble through empty market stalls. He had brought a single apple and set it on the fountain's edge, a small offering. Wintertide came with frost, but not with light. Candles were lit in windows, but they were memorials, not celebrations. The sweet bread was rare. The songs of the season were replaced by silence. That year, the city forgot how to rejoice. And yet, not all light was lost. A woman strung dried oranges along her fence, just as her mother had. A boy carved a star into the snow outside his door. A group of singers gathered, distanced, masked, and hummed a single hymn at dusk. No words, just breath turned into music. Alaric passed them on his way home and paused. He did not join them. He only listened. He wrote that night, "The city has not forgotten. It has only quieted its joy. It waits beneath the ashes." In the following spring, the flowers bloomed again. Children picked them this time, timidly at first, then with laughter. Wreaths reappeared on doors. A woman placed a pot of violets on every window along her street. A man handed out seed cakes in the square, one for each passerby. Someone played a lute. The notes were uncertain, but no one minded. The mayor, aged and pale from months of mourning, declared a day of memory. Not a festival, not a feast, but a gathering. People came with tokens, photos, ribbons, drawings, pieces of cloth. They placed them in the square in a spiral, circling inward like a river of remembrance. No speeches were given, only silence, shared. Alaric brought his mask. He set it gently in the spiral's center. He stepped back, hands folded. No one asked why. No one needed to. The following week, the potters painted bells, small, delicate, no bigger than a plum. Each. One bore a different color, a different name. They were given freely, hung in windows, on trees, from doorposts. When the wind blew, they chimed, soft, like laughter returning. Summer came with cautious celebration. No large festivals, no great fires, but picnics returned. Storytellers sat on benches and spoke softly. Music played. Dances began again. 2 or 3 people at a time, slow, careful, smiling. Alaric was asked to speak at the Midsummer Circle. He declined. Instead, he handed a child a poem he had written, and the boy read it aloud. A city sleeps and wakes again, with quieter breath, with softer hand. What joy remains, it shall be shared. In memory's light, the heart repaired. People clapped, not loudly, but with feeling. By autumn, the harvest brought real bounty. Apples were laid in baskets, cider brewed, loaves broken, and shared in 2s and 3s. Alaric walked among them, receiving nods, thanks, and sometimes just quiet smiles. One man handed him a string of roasted chestnuts. He held it for a long time. That evening he wrote, "The festivals did not die. They rested, like seeds, waiting for sun." Joy did not return all at once, but it came, in songs, in laughter, in shared food, in ribbons on trees and candles in lanterns, in bells that chimed softly in the breeze. And the city remembered not just how to survive, it remembered how to celebrate. There came a day when Alaric was called to a house at the far end of the city, the last such call he would receive. It was a simple dwelling, tucked against the old outer wall, shaded by a fig tree whose roots coiled like sleeping serpents. The shutters were closed, but not nailed. A small mark had been drawn in chalk above the threshold, a circle with a line through it, a quiet signal, passed by survivors, that someone within was unwell, but alive. Alaric approached slowly. The door creaked open at his touch. Inside, the air was warm, tinged with the scent of thyme and old wood. A woman lay in a bed near the hearth. She was not young, but not ancient either. Her face was lined with weariness, but her breath was steady. Beside her sat a man, quiet, vigilant, hands folded in his lap. He looked up as Alaric entered. "You're the last one," the man said, not accusing, not fearful, just a statement, as simple as the house itself. Alaric nodded. He stepped forward, placed his satchel down, and gently examined the woman. Her fever had broken. Her pulse, while weak, was clear. The worst had passed. "She'll live," Alaric said. The man exhaled, as if he'd been holding that breath for weeks. They sat in silence for a while. The fire crackled. Outside, birdsong threaded through the open shutter. "You've seen many," the man said at last. "I have. Too many." Alaric did not reply. He only looked at the woman, then at the tiny details of the room. A weaving loom in the corner, a shelf of worn books, a cracked bowl filled with walnuts. "This is the last." "House?" the man asked. Alaric nodded slowly. "The last call. No new bells for 10 days. No new flags. The guild says it is over." The man was quiet for a long moment, and then he stood. He walked to the door, opened it wide, and stepped outside. He looked at the fig tree, at the street, at the sunlight pouring like gold across the stones. He turned back to Alaric. "Would you close the door behind you?" Alaric understood. He checked the woman once more, offered her a sip of water, and gathered his things. At the threshold, he paused. His hand rested on the frame, rough wood smoothed by years of use. He looked one last time into the house. Then, gently, he pulled the door closed. It latched with a soft click. He stood there for a long time, not because there was anything more to do, but because something had ended. The plague was not a beast with a single heart. It did not die in one moment, but its shadow, so long cast across every corner of the city, had finally begun to lift, and Alaric had closed its last open door. He walked slowly back through the streets. It was midday. The sun was high. Children played with hoops. A man painted, shutters red. A group of girls carried baskets of herbs. Life no longer crept. It moved. At the square, he paused. There, where the spiral of memory had once been laid, now stood a simple stone, unmarked, but clean. People sat nearby, eating, talking, living. Alaric continued home. In his quarters, he placed his satchel beside the hearth, washed his hands, and lit a candle. He removed the last page of his journal and wrote, "Today I close the final door. May it stay closed. May those inside rest, recover, and remember. May those outside walk forward with care." He signed it simply, A. He placed the journal beside the others. He opened the windows wide. The breeze carried in birdsong and the faint sound of someone tuning a lute. He closed his eyes. In the weeks that followed, Alaric no longer wore the cloak, the gloves, or the cane. He became simply Alaric again. He walked the city not as guardian, but as neighbor. People greeted him by name. Some asked if he was well. He always said yes, even when he wasn't quite. He began teaching small classes, young, scribes who wanted to learn, who had lost family and found purpose in parchment. He told them stories of herbs, of healing, of holding on, and when asked, of the day he closed the final door. They always listened quietly. He told them not of despair, but of dignity. Even when the sickness comes, he said, the soul can stay whole. He never reopened the last house. He never needed to. He passed by it once a month, just to look. The fig tree had grown fuller. The shutters were open. A bowl of water sat on the windowsill, for birds or cats or memory. And the door, sturdy, smooth, sunlit, remained closed. Not in grief but in peace. Part 20. Echoes in the Quiet. The memory of the mask time passed, as it always does. The plague had ended. The city, though scarred, stood. And Alaric, once a figure of shadow and silence, became a man of habit, of paper, of walking without fear. He no longer carried the cane. He no longer heard the bell toll each morning. But still, the memory of the mask lingered. Not in fear, not in sorrow, but as a quiet echo. It lived in the way people paused, just briefly, when passing the old burial ground, nodding, whispering names, or simply looking. It lived in the way candles were now kept near every door, not just for light, but for remembrance. It lived in the way children drew birds not only with wings, but with long, curved beaks, and smiled as they did. The mask had become a symbol, shaped first by necessity, then by fear, and finally by care. Alaric had kept his, nestled in its box of wool, tucked into a shelf in his small study. He did not display it, nor did he hide it away. It was part of the story, part of him. One afternoon, he was invited to speak at the new Civic Hall. The building stood where the old archive had once burned. Now rebuilt, it held books, meeting rooms, and a quiet garden in the back. The hall had been decorated with drawings by children, scenes of the city, of rivers and trees, of people dancing again. In the center was a display, a table with simple objects, a worn bell cracked at its base, a pair of gloves stitched and faded, a clay bowl blackened by candle wax, a journal open to a page titled "To the Living," and beside it all, a mask. His mask. Alaric stood before it in silence. A young girl tugged her mother's sleeve. "Is that a bird?" she asked. "No," the mother whispered. "That's the face that watched over us." The ceremony was brief. Alaric was asked to say something. He stepped forward, his steps slow, his back not as straight as it had once been. He looked at the crowd. Not large, not grand, but full of listening faces. And he spoke. "In the years of the plague," he said, "I wore a mask, not to frighten, not to hide, but to stay, to remain when others could not." He paused. It was never the mask that healed. It was the choice to wear it, the willingness to walk into sorrow and say, "You are not alone." He looked down. I was not a hero. I was afraid, as you were. But I walked, because walking mattered. He stepped back. No applause, only silence. And then, a soft chime. A boy had rung the small cracked bell. Its tone was not clear, not perfect, but it rang. That evening, Alaric returned home. He lit a candle by his window, as he did each night. He sat with a cup of tea, the steam curling like stories not yet told. The mask remained in the hall. It did not need to return. In his study, he began a new book, not a journal of plague or death or duty, but a book of quiet days. He titled it, "When the City Sang Again." He wrote of small joys, the baker's laughter, the return of pears to the market, the cat that had claimed the chapel steps as her throne. He wrote of mornings when he walked with no destination, of afternoons when he sat beside the fountain and listened to people speak. Not of loss, but of tomorrow. He wrote of silence. Not as fear, but as peace. He lived simply. He rose with the sun. He taught. He tended a small garden behind his home, thyme, rosemary, and a single fig tree, grown from a clipping taken near the last house. Sometimes visitors came. They asked questions. They wanted to know what it had been like. He told them stories, not of death, but of candles left on windowsills, of music played to empty streets, of hands that shook but still reached out, of names remembered. One winter, a boy arrived, wide-eyed, curious. He had found one of Alaric's journals in the library and had read every page. He sat at the old man's feet and asked, "Were you afraid?" Alaric smiled gently. "Every day." "Did you want to stop?" "Yes." "But you didn't." "No," Alaric said, "because someone had to stay, and I had hands to hold, and words to write." The boy thought for a long moment. "Would you do it again?" Alaric looked out the window, at the snow falling, at the smoke rising from chimneys, at the soft bell that now rang not for death, but for supper. "Yes," he said. And then, after a pause, "But I hope no one ever has to." The boy stayed for tea. They sat in silence. 2 generations listening to the fire, the wind, the quiet. The next morning, Alaric walked through the city one last time. Not as a doctor, not as a figure of mourning, but as a man. He passed the bakery, the chapel, the square. He paused by the fountain, then continued to the wall beyond the fig tree. There, he stood beneath the branches, touched the bark gently, and closed his eyes. A breeze stirred, and he whispered, "Remember us kindly."